course, as you might imagine, when James said, please would you come and you talk about whatever you want, I said, not a problem. So think about this, right? Think about bureaucracy. The word bureaucracy, bureaucrats, bureaucratic, those probably don't give you a real positive vibe, right? And yet there's something that happens, and organizations seem to become bureaucratic. And if we want to actually talk about what we can see as keeping away from the negatives but getting the positives, we've got to understand something about where they come from. What are bureaucracies? Where do they come from? Why do they create? And what should we do about it, if anything? So imagine a typical startup, right? It's you and 3 best friends. You're all together. You've got an idea. You're all in one room, right? Everybody just does what makes sense. It's one for all and all for one. It's the perfect startup. And you work, right? It works. You do well. You have to grow. You need to bring on more people. You find yourself saying, you know, we need some specialists. We need some people who understand certain things that we really need to focus on. And some of them are the non-technical rights, right? We need somebody to do the books. We need somebody to pay the taxes. You're going to say, I'm going to need those people because they have specific and special knowledge that we can do, but it's probably not very efficient or effective. There's things that we should be doing instead of that. So you can imagine, most of us do our own taxes, like many of us. Many of us may not like to do our own taxes, but we can. The odds are that none of us want to be in a position of doing an appendectomy on one of our coworkers, right? You really rather go to a specialist for that. So there's this, if I have the specialist, the idea is they can help me be more efficient and effective. They can do something faster than I can. They can do a better job of it than I can. Okay. But then you get to the point where now the organization's growing, and you have these specialists. And the thing is, not all the specialists have to talk to everybody else. I mean, you don't have to have the accountant to help you do the user interface. And you don't have the people from DevOps have to help file the taxes, right? They just don't even really need to know anything about that. Well, then, how do you figure out who does have to figure things out? Well, you create an org chart, of course. So this man, who, it's hard to say exactly what he looks like. His name is David McCallum. He had this problem. He was the senior manager at the largest railroad in the United States, which was a massive 500 miles of rail line in 1855. And he found it extremely difficult to manage. He said, look, any one person can manage 50 miles of track, but 500 cannot be done. We have to divide it up. So he created the first organization chart of any company in the United States. And frankly, you can get this from the Library of Congress. It is a true masterpiece. If you plot it out at about 3 feet by 5 feet, it's a beautiful piece of art. It's hand done. It's very organic. Each of the leaves and branches looks like a tree, and each dot is an individual person. A few things to notice on this. The president and the board of directors at the bottom. The general supervisor, who was McCallum, is the next one up on the trunk. On the sides, you find the organizations like the people that operate ticketing and things like that, the functional organizations. And then up here you see parallel tracks. One is a map of the rail line with all the stations identified. Beside it, the people that run the tracks that run the operation on that track. And of course, you'll notice one other thing. IT is on this org chart, reporting directly to the senior-most manager. Now, the idea behind the organization is, and the splitting up into organization, the concept or the intent is you're going to split activities up into subgroups The responsibility and authority and the budget and things will be disseminated out. Each of the people will meet their own specific targets, and goodness will prevail. Now, this sounds a whole lot like asking every bit of the organization to be optimal, right? So the idea is that this focus on individual layers will allow us, once again, to be more efficient and effective. And it works up to a point. And then we run into the same specialist generalist idea again. We have people specialists who don't know anything else about the business, but now it's organizations of specialists who only talk to themselves and don't know anything about the rest of the business. This is where you start to get functional silos. There's this concept of, it's actually one of the things that comes out of theory of constraints, called the engines of disharmony. And you see this progression from I don't know how what I do contributes, to I don't know what those guys do that contributes, to aspects of conflict between organizations, and just I feel bad about what I'm doing, and I can't explain why, but it's what we've always done. Right? Now, what's happening is the system becomes increasingly complex. And when it becomes increasingly complex, high priority issues or accidents or escapes become more frequent. So now I'm going to bring in the first of 2 or 3 concepts. Charles Perrow and other researchers studied large-scale systemic accidents, things like nuclear power plant meltdowns, space shuttle accidents. And what they found is there was an extremely strong correlation between system complexity and the accidents. And it reached a point beyond a threshold where if you had a certain degree of complexity, accidents became inevitable. That is, they became normal. So Perrow named this normal accident theory. Now, there's 2 factors that are extremely important in normal accident theory: interaction and coupling. So interaction is the way that all the parts of the process relate to each other. And he puts it on a scale between linear and very obvious on one extreme and very complex and ambiguous on the other. Right? And then coupling as how closely the parts influence each other. And this is between very tight coupling and very loose coupling. Now, think about this in terms of standing up dominoes, right? If I have a bunch of dominoes across the table here, and they're a foot apart, and I knock one of them over, it's not going to bother any of the others. That's loose coupling. If I have them an inch apart, and I knock one of them over, it'll rapidly knock the rest over. That's tight coupling. Now, for those of you who know the Cynefin Framework, and I'm going to get to that in a minute, Dave Snowden goes to great lengths to point out that the Kineton Framework is not a 2x2 categorization matrix. This is a 2x2 categorization matrix. Okay? So if you have loosely coupled systems, this is a modification on the way Perrow shows the chart. I've switched the x-axis for a reason you'll see in a minute. Loosely coupled, there tends to be more safety, more ability to fix things. Tightly coupled, there isn't. And when things are linear, they're more predictable. You can see what's happening. When they're complex, they don't. And in this particular area, in this theory, the domain to watch out for is the top left. You have extremely complex issues with little to no line of sight, very ambiguous connections, and extremely tightly coupled. For instance, extremely tightly scheduled. Now, this is a partial map of where Perrow puts different types of organizations. Now, notice he's putting traditional manufacturing, I would call this pre-lean manufacturing, in the lower right-hand corner. This is manufacturing where there's tons of work in process inventory. There are expediting processes, things like that. Kind of the litmus test question is, how much faster could we go if we expedite? And the greater the difference between the normal speed cycle time and the expedited cycle time gives you a degree of how tight or loose coupled the system is. Continuous flow operations in the upper right-hand corner. The ultimate being a hydroelectric dam. I mean, you don't get any simpler or more basic or more continuous or tightly coupled than water flowing through a turbine, right? It's just that simple. Classic research and development, lower left, there is no real schedule. You're just off experimenting. You have no idea even whether what you're working on is going to have any value. So it's loosely coupled, but very complex. And Perot's a sociologist, so he has his own opinions. He puts nuclear power and recombinant DNA up in the upper left-hand corner. And his own perception is, by the way, that they are so inherently dangerous, meaning the consequences of an accident, that we should abandon them. So, like I said, he's a sociologist. So. Now, here's the deal. If traditional factories started in the lower right-hand corner, then that's where the initial concepts of lean or flow or improvement started. So most of the methods and tools that came out of that environment, what they endeavor to do is move the organization upward into a point where you have more continuous flow, things are more efficient, they're more effective, there's less waste, right? So what happens then is the first run through when we tried to move those methods and tools out of that traditional manufacturing into things like product development and R&D, we tried doing exactly the same thing, right? And we moved it straight up, went right up into the area where you have chaotic situations and emergent activities. Now, what do? If you're in a complex product development situation, you've gone smack dab up in the upper left-hand corner, you've had a systemic accident, right? What you have to do at that point is reduce the amount of tight coupling and or reduce the amount of interaction. Make things more linear. You can do that by either saying, okay, let's add more time, let's add more budget, let's add more people, or let's reduce features. Now what will happen is that will bring you down. Now you can get a handle on things, and then in the end you can actually go back up, presumably. I could talk a lot more about this one, but I'm not going to. Now what that realizes is there is some chaos domain. There's some threshold. It may look roughly like this. The bad news is nobody really has a clue where the boundary is, right? All we know is it's going to be lower on the left. Now, if you're in very early product development and you're in chaos, things just aren't coming together. How do you get out of it? You get out of it by increasing or decreasing the amount of complexity, decrease the ambiguity, make some decisions. If you're in late-stage product development and you run into trouble, if you're writing a piece of code and it's scheduled to go out in 2 weeks, but it's not coming together, you can come together and say, okay, tell you what, let's reduce half the feature set. Well, okay, but it's still due in 2 weeks. That may not be sufficient, right? So what you might say is, okay, wait, let's back off another month. So you have to reduce ambiguity, you have to reduce the amount of tight coupling. The reason I'm pointing this out is that's two situations that may be in product development, but the way you get out of it is completely different. Now, we want to get out of the chaos zone. There seem to be different ways to do that. Clearly, some of it is have the right people making the right decisions at the right time. And there's an idea about having enough slack or loose coupling to be able to handle things that show up. We can never know everything we need to know, right? So we have to find a way to make sense of what's going on, which brings up topic number 2, which is the Cynefin Framework. So how many of you heard Dave Snowden talk? Here, good, because I'm going to go through it just enough to be able to go off on it. So Dave created the Cynefin Framework, which is a sense-making approach to be able to understand what's going on. A lot of information on their website, and the Harvard Business Review article from November 2007 is very good. Sooner or later, someone will write a book about the Cynefin Framework, but it hasn't been written yet. This is the sense of what the framework looks like. And again, to point out again, this is not a 2x2 matrix, which is why it's drawn with swoopy lines and no outside boundaries. But essentially, the lower right corner is the simple domain where cause and effect is clearly obvious. The right way to handle things is sense what's happening, categorize it, and then respond appropriately. This is the legitimate domain of best practice. There really is a best practice there, and it really is effective. It is appropriate to use it. In the upper right, in complicated, cause and effect still applies, but now it's only obvious after you analyze. You have to sense what's happening, analyze it, and then know how to respond. So this is the domain of experts. There is no longer a single best practice that's appropriate. There may be multiple good practices. In the upper left, Snowden's version of complex, where you cannot analyze the right answer in advance. You can only figure it out by experimentation. So you have to probe, try multiple safe-to-fail experiments, sense what's happening, and respond. Chaos is just, it's totally random. You have to just act and see what happens. The domain of disorder in the center is extremely important because very often that's the place where we find ourselves, where we just really don't know what else is going on. Very often, when you look at a problem or a set of issues you're facing, this is more like what it looks like. There's a large number of things in disorder. Now, when there's a large number of things in disorder in a widely distributed organization, this is when the conflicts happen. And the conflicts happen because people have multiple different ideas on what to do about it. People who believe that the world should be viewed through the simple domain say, well, look, we just need to go back to what's worked in the past. We just have to go back to one simple approach we all work. We just have to have a best practice for that. Or the answer is clearly on page 312 of the manual. Are you trying to tell me you didn't read the manual? Right. People who believe it's in a complicated domain, these are the experts, right? Now you have the experts all wrapped up around you saying, well, I'm an expert in that. Let me handle that. It's like, no, no, no. I'm an expert in this. Let me handle it, right? People who believe it's complex say, well, we probably ought to run some more tests and some more focus groups, talk to some more potential customers. And meanwhile, the people who believe it's in chaos, who've been getting increasingly frustrated in this conversation, pound their fists on the table and say, we don't have time for any more of this. Just put me in total and complete dictatorial control, and I will reestablish order. Now, the thing is, each of them is right in their own appropriate context. Right? There are situations where each one of those is absolutely the correct response. But what happens is we tend to get ourselves entrained in what we all feel is comfortable. There are appropriate uses for each domain. There are also inappropriate ones taken to an extreme. We want to use standard methods and processes. That's appropriate use in the simple domain. Inappropriate, or to an extreme, is you end up with stifling bureaucracy. This is the people who still insist that a quintuplet form that has to use carbon paper be filled out before you can request a new piece of equipment, right? Because that was the way the process was established 30 years ago. And I don't care if you can't find any carbon paper, that's the process. You want to be able to use experts. You don't want them to be in silos taking pot shots at each other. You want to be able to capitalize on opportunities when they come up, totally emergent. You don't want complete undirected self-organization. And you want to be able to create the aspects of innovation, and it's somewhat like creativity, like Andrea was talking about, but you don't want complete anarchy either. Now, going back to the supposed topic of this presentation, bureaucracies, what we see as bureaucracies are the two extremes on the right side. There's the bureaucratic entrainment, people who think that you're just not following the instructions. And there's the expert entrainment, which is the people who think, well, I know the answer to everything, and we'll tell it to you. Those are two of the forms of bureaucracies run across. Now, how do we get rid of those? How do we deal with that? First off, when you look at a product life cycle, and I have put a caveat on this because I'm oversimplifying it, when you start out with some unknown product, you are up in the complex domain. You literally don't know what the final product looks like. You have to experiment. You have to try things out. As things become clearer and as the ideas get more gelled and it comes down to, all right, now we know what we're going to do. We know what features we're going to put on. Now we just need to work out the details. You can move through those different domains. Well, what that means is what we would call the organizations or the specialists involved also changes. Now, the implications of this is that if you have a large organization and these are each different groups, then it's probably completely appropriate and expected that they would be organized differently. Maybe operating with different rules, different organizational norms. Not just expected, it would actually be totally appropriate. And there's my caveat to say, yes, there are actually loopbacks. It's not this simple. Now, what you would expect then is, early in product development, when you're in the complex domain, you would expect a more flat organizational structure, very horizontally organized, and a mixed bag of specialist generalists. As things become clearer, now you want more teams of experts working on specific technical issues. And if you were making a physical product, which you were manufacturing, you might end up with the goal state in the simple domain where you've just got this assembly line process kicking out things every 15 to 20 seconds, right? Now, I'll point out that nothing is static in these specific areas. So be wary about saying this is exactly and totally where it's going to go. This is a sense-making model, so a lot of it depends on tracking where you are right now and what's going on and whether you need to make any changes. All right, now, how do we put together normal accident theory, or the tweak of it that I made, and then the Cynefin Framework to be able to make sense of what we should do organizationally? Well, the bad news and good news is there is no perfect organizational structure. But there are things we can do that both top-down and bottom-up. We talked some about, yesterday morning, actually, I think part of Bob Lewis's talk, about making changes and then creating rules. We will create rules which then take on a life of their own, and the rules themselves become problems. So part of what we have to do is we have to periodically go in and figure out which old rules we need to get rid of. And from discussion at Open Space the other day, one of the ways around that is the concept of mission contracts and commander's intent. And if you ever want to get a whole other thing to read about, go read about John Boyd and his rules for organizational success. All right, the good news and bad news about these, the top-down and bottom-up, is that we already know what they are. And now what that means is there's no secrets, right? I'm not going to like, oh, here's the whole secret to doing it. It's right here. You already knew it. You need to have protective capacity. You have to be aware of queuing theory. You have to have WIP limits. That you have to have, one way to do this is have a strategic bench of experts in a large organization that can be trainers and coaches and mentors and also operate like a SWAT team that can go in and help people learn how to solve problems that they're having particular issues with. All the different aspects of buffer or management reserve or schedule margin are a way to actually put in that time to be able to handle things that come up. And intentionally ambiguous organizational boundaries. Hyman Rickover, the father of the nuclear navy, purposely made very ambiguous organizational boundaries. And he did it on purpose because he said, nuclear power is inherently dangerous. We have to be extremely careful. No one should ever, ever say, that's not my job. He made it so it was your job, no matter who you were, if you saw a problem, to take action and fix it. Within a Kanban context, right, what Kanban does is it reduces WIP, it prioritizes tasks, it reduces the need for this bureaucratic control. Similarly, we need to build networks, and networks between people, right? We, within Boeing, have an internal social networking site, which is sort of a cross between Twitter and Facebook. Totally internally, it encourages discussion. It makes it incredibly easy to create groups, of which we have hundreds. Some are tiny, some are large. People get together and form discussions. So I have, just like Twitter, I have multiple friends all over the country now that I've actually never met, all that other Boeing employees, and we can work together and solve problems. We have created a grand challenge within product development of how self-organizing teams to go work issues. There's an issue called Dreamstarter within the social networking site of people creating teams and then having other people vote on which ones they think are the best ideas. The discussion the other day by Spotify when they were talking about their office design of having squad rooms and then open areas. Again, it's a way to encourage people to connect, right? Rotating between organizations. Another aspect of Kanban, it makes tasks visible. And when the more visible things are, the less need for bureaucratic control. And I also want to talk about bottom-up implementation. Bottom-up implementations are often ignored. So I have a friend, Jack Goodstein, who wrote a paper a number of years ago in what he called the Mosquito Model for bottom-up implementation of change. And he points out that mosquitoes are difficult to detect. They're frankly quite harmless in and of themselves. But one bite from one can have a really pretty significant impact. So a mosquito then is a change agent that derives their authority purely from their coworkers and peers, not from the hierarchy. And as you point out, anybody can do it. You just start. Now, Jack's methodology, in a nutshell, he said, find something that nobody wants to do, but is necessary. He refers to this as cleaning latrines. Now, if you volunteer to do it, no one is going to say no. You will immediately be allowed to do it. No one's going to give you a lot of oversight. You can use whatever method you want, and you can try things out. This is a sandbox experiment. If you're successful, you'll probably get a chance to try something bigger. And it encourages other people to try as well. All right, now, I want to end with a case study historical example of a bottom-up implementation in a very bureaucratic organization. So once upon a time, there was an organization which later on became part of a larger organization through a series of mergers and acquisitions. They had in the past a brilliant CEO who had managed to fight off a series of hostile takeover attempts because he was extremely skilled. He made all the decisions. Very top-down, almost imperial management approach, but highly effective, right? Now, he was long gone, but the current leadership of the organization still felt that they were in his mold, even though there were, frankly, a lot of other things they preferred to do than specifically working on their skills and requirements. Now, what this meant was the skill of the management of this organization was, frankly, getting worse and worse as time went on. And There were certain parts of the organization, however, that were actually highly advantageous that people liked to get into. They weren't necessarily the most effective or the most important. Now, this was barely acceptable during the best of times, but this was the worst of times, because there was a major competitor in the same geographical area that had just gone through a major reorganization, revitalized themselves as a startup, and done a major pivot. Now, they actually did things that were much more based on skill rather than just who you knew and what your name was. They also had a significantly different management succession planning process. And what this meant was some of the aspects of them got very good very fast. They also had a new chief operating officer, later to become CEO, that had a very aggressive approach to strategy for acquisitions. Now, part of the reason he was so good is he had started out in the high-tech part of the organization, right? And the high-tech part of the organization was something that the traditional leadership really, frankly, didn't have a clue about, and they didn't really like it. So they let other people go into it. So what happened was the existing organization lost two major campaigns in very quick succession to this revitalized startup. And partly it was because they were too bureaucratic. The startup was extremely agile. The existing organization was extremely slow and bureaucratic. Now, there was a middle manager named Scharnhorst who decided something had to be done. He didn't ask permission. He didn't ask for an okay. What he did is he formed a study group. He got together a group of people, and they met every Wednesday night, and they gave lectures to each other, and they came up with ideas. They published a manifesto, which talked about how they valued skill and respect for common people, which not everybody in the organization agreed with. And what they did is they made a proposal to leadership, and they said, we seem to be in a bit of trouble right now. We think we have an idea we can fix this issue. So the leadership said, okay, do it. So they trained a whole series of internal change agents, very much following a go-to-the-gemba type operation, getting people directly involved in the front lines, as it were. And then they assigned them one-on-one to the leadership. And the leaders who were effective from that point on listened to these new assistants. The ones that were not effective didn't. And the assistants all filed what today we would call blogs, which they would send back to headquarters so that there would be massive learning throughout the organization. Well, the fact of the matter is, this worked extremely well. So even though we had an extremely bureaucratic, very organized, very traditional approach, they completely revitalized how effectively they could manage the organization in a very short time period. So what it says is, yes, a small, informal, bottom-up implementation change agents can impact very strong cultures, and more importantly, they can fight off tough competition. All right, now, I will now attempt to bring us all the way back to the original question. Organizations exist because they provide advantages, right? So it gets back to Ray Ullman's comment about tribes. What we want to be able to do is get more of what we want and less of what we don't want from having them. We can do that by a series of things like reduction of tight coupling, aspects of productive capacity, and encouraging people to make connections, right? That's true. So will startups turn into bureaucracies? The simple answer is yes, because we want that aspect of standards, and we want some aspect of things that are dependable and predictable. We want contracts written correctly, right? We want to make sure we don't get sued. At the same time, People need to be able to break out of their silos and be a little more communicative. So maybe at some point, the accountant should help be in on the user interface. Maybe DevOps should help file the taxes, right? At least enough to understand here's what's going on in the business. A bureaucracy implies standards. And I'm using bureaucracy in a more positive tone now. And the standards can be a path to continuous improvement. This gets back to more of a kata approach. And done well, then, the bureaucratic part of the organization can be agile and flexible enough not just to keep up with the rest of the organization, they may actually be able to lead it. So if bureaucracies are inevitable, is this the next step? And just because I know that everybody, like Jabe said, wants to go off and read the books, here's a few of the references that are drawn to. So, time for a question?